Hello, and welcome to another episode of Between the Lines. I'm your host, Muhammad Omar Iftikhar. This podcast is produced by the Media Department at the Institute of Business Management. Today, we are going to feature the first ever international author on our series. He is Mr. Adrian Tchaikovsky. And we are thrilled and honored to have Mr. Adrian with us on the show. Especially myself, I am a published science fiction author, and he is also a published science fiction author. And I have learned so much about this genre by reading his books. And when we talk about the profile of Mr. Adrian, he is a British titan of fantasy and science fiction. He has captivated and mesmerized readers with his epic Shadows of the Apt series and the Children of Time trilogy, exploring tales of evolution, AI, and alien civilizations. He is a recipient of some of the most prestigious awards bestowed upon fantasy and science fiction authors, including the Arthur C. Clarke Award, Hugo Award, British Fantasy Award, and the British Science Fiction Association or BSFA Award, which helped him cement his place as a genre luminary. As a published science fiction author myself, it is my honor, and it is an honor for IoBM, for Between the Lines, to welcome Mr. Adrian on Between the Lines. Hello, sir.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
It is always a pleasure to talk to people who are part of the publishing industry, but also who are, helping the industry grow and evolve, and you are one of them. Uh, so let's dive into what I expect to be a very interesting conversation. So tell us, how did you end up becoming a science fiction author? Was it a spur of inspiration, or was it something you had always envisioned, or did it just was it just an opportunity that presented in front of you?
I've always been a very, very keen reader. That was my first introduction to science fiction. Some television like Doctor Who, but really just going through all the shelves of the local library when I was a kid. What my big sort of creative outlet was when I was younger was role-playing games. I used to be a games master, which involves a lot of creating worlds and creating characters and all of this, all of these skills which are very easily transferable to writing. But at the time, the idea of writing a book never really seemed realistic until I came across a series of books called the Dragonlance Chronicles, which were basically a write-up of someone's Dungeons and Dragons game. And that was just this bridge that said, yeah, this is something you could do. And it turns out I needed to take quite a long time to develop my writing style, which I think is the most difficult part of the process. But the creative exercise that you're going through in those games is very, very similar to the exercise you run through when you're creating a world and characters for a novel.
Great. And as you know, you would have experienced this time and again that world building is the key or the essence when you're writing science fiction. So when I was going through your profile, it's interesting to see that you have your background associated with zoology and also with law. So did these two dimensions supported you in creating worlds for your science fiction narratives?
Yes, I mean, so zoology particularly, it's always been a fascination of mine from when I was very young. I grew up with sort of David Attenborough documentaries, and certainly my science fiction work is the majority of it's either got animals in it actually from Earth, like the spiders and Children of Time, or it's got what I hope are quite sort of interesting and believable aliens that are also drawn from an understanding of, how animals work, how evolution works, all of these sort of scientific principles, to the extent you can apply that to something from another planet. I mean, law is a bit different. So I ended up in law because essentially I needed to pay the bills, because being an unpublished writer doesn't really bring in much money. And there was essentially a series of peculiar coincidences and events that eventually led to me getting involved in law. Partly, I started off with a legal secretary, and I got there because I had the typing speed because I was a writer.
Oh, good.
But then law has sort of fed into the book. So there's a lawyer character in the Final Architecture series. There is quite a large courtroom scene to my book Dogs of War, and so certainly a sort of a fascination with how we codify societies and how we kind of create these structures to govern societies has come out of sort of exposure to real world legal practice.
So whenever you're writing, so do you follow some special ritual? Do you have some writer thing with you that you pursue, or do you just write with the flow?
I mean, I find I've got a relatively efficient writing process. So there's nothing particularly I need other than sort of a modicum of space. I tend to get out of the house, I suppose, is the big thing, because there are too many distractions inside the house. So I'll go to somewhere to get a cup of coffee and just sit there with a laptop and my headphones on and music playing. But generally, I'm very adaptable. And so, for example, I write really well on trains. I write in hotel rooms. I can write in airports. So it does mean I can do once you get going as a writer. There's a certain amount of other stuff you have to do. I do quite a lot of conventions, for example, because it's a chance to connect with other writers. And writing is a fairly solitary profession in its normal sort of habitat. But it does mean whenever I'm traveling around or wherever I am, I can generally, if I've got a couple of hours, I can pull the laptop out and get some work done and just sort of keep up with the deadlines.
So talking about music, I mean, I've heard this, that if you're writing a particular type of a scene, so if you listen to an equally apt or a music that relates to that scene, that you can write better. Is that true?
I mean, I certainly find it helps. So I have playlists on my phone for different sort of different moods, sort of, sad scenes or action scenes and things like that. And I think it helps, at least in it puts your mind in the right kind of place.
Mm-hmm.
I know. I mean, my wife is an academic. She's actually doing a study at the moment on how writers use music as part of their writing process. And one of the things that seems to have come out of that is there's an enormous range of different approaches. But certainly for me, I tend to need music that has the right kind of tempo and mood and tone for the scene I'm writing. And I'll switch from one list to another if the mood in the scene changes.
Okay. So whenever you're creating your worlds for your novel, how do you create this balance that they remain foreign as well as relatable to the readers?
It's a difficult question to answer, because I think a lot of what's going on in the process is probably subconscious. So it's a gut feeling sort of thing. The foreignness, the alienness of what I'm writing tends to come from the world building and the preparation that I've done, which is that's a major part of my sort of creative process. I'll always start off with the world, and I'll spend a fair amount of time exploring it and following the logic of it. I think you're building a thought experiment. Well, what would change if this was true in this world, and then what changes because of that, and what changes because of that, and you follow it outwards. And if you are true to the logic, then you'll probably end up with something that is genuinely quite alien. And I guess my best writing advice there is always challenge your own assumptions about how things work, because everyone comes with a certain set of standard ways that they're going to do a thing, and those assumptions will be based in your own experience. And if you're trying to do an alien world or a fantastical world, you kind of need to step out from that and just be aware of what you're unconsciously bringing to the table. How that then becomes relatable to the audience, I think a lot of it comes down to, even if you've got a very alien world, frequently the problems that the characters are facing are going to be identifiable. This is certainly how I was working with Children of Time. So you've got the spider society that evolves,
Yes.
and they are very different to us. But on the other hand, at the large scale, they have problems with wars and they have problems with plagues, and these create a kind of a commonality. And when you can see a creature that is very non-human, but it's still essentially having to courageously face up to a relatable problem, I think that does build a bit of a bridge of empathy between the reader and that character.
So, I mean, creating worlds and creating foreign terrains, something which is not relatable to us as humans. So you would also need to create. I mean, obviously, when you're creating a new world, you have to create laws that are related to that world. So how difficult was it for you when you began when you ventured into this genre to you know remember the laws that you have created for your world?
I mean, when I was doing it when I was younger, it was very easy. And these days, when I'm older, I have to make lots of notes. So, yeah, I mean, I used to be better, I think, at holding all of these sort of hundreds of details of the world in my head. Certainly when I was writing Shadows of the Apt, which is an enormous series of books, far longer really than any series needs to be. There are thousands of characters and all of these different factions and cities and sort of political groups, and it all seemed to come very naturally, and I didn't really have any kind of reference that I was making. It was all just in my head. And nowadays, one single book, I'm having to constantly make notes on, well, what am I calling this, and what is the saying that these people use, and that sort of thing. Because otherwise, you'll include a thing and you'll say, yes, obviously, these people always use this particular phrase, and then you'll never use it again in the book because you'll have forgotten you put it in. So yes, I these days I tend to make fairly copious notes as I go through the book, just to make sure. Also to make sure little things like making sure the characters' names are spelt the same way all the time, because I'm terrible for that if I'm not careful.
So growing up, was there any particular science fiction show, television series, a book, a novel that really intrigued you or really helped you enter this genre of writing?
So, I mean, I was a huge Doctor Who fan growing up. I mean, honestly, British television, there was Doctor Who and Blake Seven, and that was basically the science fiction you were going to get. I was a big Star Wars fan as well. Weirdly enough, though, I think the film that inspired me the most is there is a Roger Corman science fiction film called Battle Beyond the Stars.
Okay.
It is basically the Seven Samurai in space, as its structure, or the Magnificent Seven in space. It remains a kind of a sort of a guilty favorite for me. But one of the big things in it is one of the characters that they recruit to fight the evil empire is this sort of scary lizard man alien called Cayman of the Lambda Zone. And this was my first introduction to the idea that you can have the monster as the hero. And that, of course, then leads directly into most of my writing, honestly, because I am usually writing from the point of view or something that in other books would be the monster and the enemy. Spiders being the most obvious example, but watching that film for the first time and understanding that you have permission to make this thing which would normally just be the bad guy, to make that into a hero, was enormously transformative to me.
So speaking of heroes and protagonists, how do you create your protagonists for your story? Do you have a protagonist in mind and then you create a story, or do you first create a story and then you create heroes and villains for your narrative?
So what I do, I create the world.
Okay.
And then if I've done a good enough job, that world will tell me who the characters in the book are going to be, because I'll get to look at the world and think, right, who are the interesting perspectives that will let me show off the details of this world best.
Okay.
And then that will become the main character, and the villains and all of the other characters will sort of evolve from that. And the same generally goes with the actual plot of the book will come out of the world, because the plot will be, right, what are the sort of, where are the friction points? What are the interesting things going on in the world in the moment that I've created it? And then that will generate its own story. Again, if I've done the job properly.
All right. So has it ever happened that a protagonist or a hero or any character has like literally talked to you in your imagination or your thoughts that this is what you have to write about me?
Yes, I mean, it happens quite a lot. And again, I think it's because they are arising organically out of the world. There can be quite a lot to a character that I don't necessarily consciously realize. But as I write them, all of these other logical details of, well, obviously, this is how they have to be, and this is what they're going to think, and this is how they would react in this circumstance. It turns up quite naturally out of the details of the world that I built. So frequently you will get a character who, possibly they're supposed to be quite a small character in the book, and then you get to their section and they turn out to be fantastically interesting. They kind of take over. I've just had a book out called Bee Speaker, and there's a character in that era who is a sort of an uplifted cyborg lizard, who and you get several sections from the character's point of view, and they turned out to be so much more engaging, and they kind of take over the book for a lot of it, just because they're such an interesting character to write.
So speaking of characters, there is this you published your latest novel called Alien Clay, and there is this character Charles in it who is a robot.
Oh, that's so Charles is in Service Model.
Service Model. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So he's is in your novel Service Model, and you wrote from the perspective of a robot for the first time. Previously, all your characters were mostly humans. Mm-hmm. So how was this experience of writing from the minds and the thoughts of a robot?
It was very, very interesting, because one of the things I wanted to be as strict with myself as possible, that Charles would react basically like a machine with programming, very, very complex programming it's complex enough that it has kind of weird clashes of priorities, so you get odd behaviors out of him. But Charles himself would argue that he doesn't have any thoughts, and that he's not a conscious being, and he's merely following directives. And walking that tightrope, so that he was also a character who came over as a sympathetic figure that you could sort of identify with, and at the same time was at least plausibly only following sort of rules and guidelines set down in his programming, was a really tricky thing for the book. That was one of the more interesting writing exercises for a character's voice, I think. And hopefully when you read the book, it's still open as to how much Charles is really a thinking being, and how much he's just following this very complex set of priorities.
So when you were developing the character of Charles, did you create that character totally as an android, or at the back of your mind, did you have this concept that this person could also be referred to as a human because of the feelings that he generates, or because
I mean, to a certain extent, the whole book is really that conversation. So yes, it's a major feature of the book, and you have another character in the book who is determined to believe that Charles has become sort of fully conscious by the action of a sort of a computer virus that sort of transformed him in some way, which Charles himself absolutely denies. But how much Charles is as it were a real person, and how much Charles is just a robot is a major theme of the book, and hopefully it's something that readers can kind of.
All right. So, I mean, it's always interesting to read a novel or a story in which the readers have to decide something on by themselves, because that that gives them that extra sense of, or an extra edge of introspection into the novel. Also, they can also talk to themselves about the story. So one of your story, one of your novel was Elder Race, which was published in 2021. So the premise is, without giving any spoilers, that Earth sends a generational ship to explore new colonies. So what kind of a narrative do you think these narratives set? Because obviously we as humans want to explore new frontiers and new territories. So what was the premise of writing Elder Race?
So Elder Race is an interesting one. It's so by the time the book starts, the colony has basically the world has been colonized, but the colonists they've sort of fallen back into a medieval sort of existence. They've got sort of kingdoms and small. They have no advanced technology, and they're living an existence where they don't really understand where they came from. At the same time, you have a later human expedition to the planet who is studying these people for sort of academic purposes. And they are very, very highly technologically sophisticated, but the one of them that's left is now cut off entirely from Earth. Some disaster has happened, apparently, that means that he's now stuck on this planet. And then he is approached by the locals who think he's a wizard, and they go on a quest. And the idea of the book really was to tell a story that is simultaneously a fantasy story told from the point of view of the people from the planet's society, and a science fiction story as told from the point of view of the anthropologist with all of his sort of technological gadgets and toys, without prioritizing either one, so that the world perspective of the kind of the warrior princess character who's traveling with him is just as valid as the perspective of the far more technologically sophisticated academic and or wizard.
So I'm my next question will be not to Adrian, the author, but to Adrian, the science fiction voice, the voice of science fiction that you have become. How close are we humans to transferring our consciousness from our human body to a mechanical body?
Now this is a really interesting one. So a few years ago, I was part of a group of authors and scientists who kind of we got together, and the scientists gave us a rundown on various aspects of this sort of technology. My understanding of our current state on this one is about 50% of the scientists who've looked at this topic believe it's not ever going to be possible, that it's literally something that can't happen, which suggests that we're not that close. If it even is possible, we're probably some considerable distance away from it. One of the problems with the idea is it's quite an old science fiction idea. Okay. The idea that you can have either the mind in a computer or like a brain in a jar, or the idea that you can separate the intellectual being from the body in that kind of dualistic way. And one of the things we know from the last sort of 15 years of medical research is actually what we think of as us, our thinking being, is not just the brain. There's a huge amount of influence from other parts of the body, the hormonal system, even things like your gut microbiome has a major impact on your mood and your emotional state, and just what decisions you might make at any given time. So you couldn't just read the brain, the activity in the brain, and then replicate that on a computer, and then that would be the person, because there's so much else going on that previously we didn't really understand. And this idea of the humanity becoming less and less emotional and more cerebral as we evolve in that kind of, it's like the Martians from H.G. Wells or various other sort of scientific ideas where you've got this sort of this huge-headed, infinitely smart creature, which is also kind of cold and callous and has no finer human feelings. The more we understand about how the human mind works, the more we realize it's all so interrelated. You couldn't just have the brain. You couldn't just have the brain sort of imprint on a computer or anything like that. So I suspect we are way further away from that than people would have said, say, 20 years ago. I know it's part of the sort of the techno-futurist dream that everyone becomes a computer and that kind of thing. But I think that those sort of ambitions are very heavily rooted in a very outdated and not terribly scientific way of looking at what we are as thinking beings.
Oh, great! That's a pretty nice way to sum it up. And speaking of characters, Adrian, do you have a favorite character that you've ever written?
I mean, there's always another one. Every book has a favorite. So for example,
If you want to pinpoint one that this is the character which is my favorite, which is my
yeah,
best.
I mean, I think maybe Ollie from The Final Architecture, honestly, just because she has so much attitude and is willing to go toe to toe with basically anything in the universe. And yeah, she was just enormously fun to write. And I think in the first book, I don't think we get any parts from her point of view, but she very much from the second and third book, we get quite a lot directly from the way she sees things. Sorry. And yeah, she was just enormously fun to write. And that tends to be what makes a favorite character for me, is just how much fun their voice is.
So coincidentally, the next question of mine was related to the Final Architecture series, which explores cosmic horror. So how did you balance threat and hope in the same story?
I find I always make sure that I add hope. I don't tend to do 100% downbeat endings. And it's a very conscious decision. I think that often with science fiction, you're writing about real world problems. Real world problems now, not just future problems. You're putting them into the future because then you can write about them with a little bit more sort of dispassion and a little bit more distance. And often I think it's easier for people to think about those problems with that kind of science fiction filter on, rather than having to think about them in the real world, where there are so many other kind of, what am I trying to say? There are so many preconceptions I think you bring to a real world problem, where if you take that out of the real world and put it into a science fiction or fantasy world, people can actually consider the ideas you're talking about more clearly. But one of the big things there is that the worst thing really is basically saying, well, here is a problem and you can't do anything about it. Because at that point, people lose interest, just purely as a survival tactic, honestly. So having hope in a story, even a massively dystopian story, is enormously important to me. With the sometimes I've got to say, if you're writing about an unpleasant enough world, you do have to manually add the hope, sort of deliberately. As far as the existential threat and the cosmic horror goes, I mean, that is, I think that's often something that's going to be innate to a certain type of story anyway. So I think if you are writing about something that is genuinely, believably alien, but is encountering humans, that's going to be a horror story at some level, because you're dealing with something that has no concept of what a human is, and that is essentially quite innocently probably going to do some terrible, terrible things with people. I mean, this is the most obvious one in my writing is the Noden sort of creature from Children of Ruin, which has an enormously traumatic first encounter with humans, because it basically sees them as an adventure to explore rather than as actual individual creatures. Excuse me. And I mean, this is another wonderful example is, and if you know Anne Leckie's Imperial Raj series, there's an alien race there called the Presga, who are appallingly powerful and very whimsical and don't really have any concept about hurting people. So when they first encounter humans, they kind of just disassemble them for fun. And they're so powerful that you can't really stop them. But then, though, it comes down to this weird tentative diplomacy of trying to convince them not to do it again, because there's no way you can physically prevent them if they decide they're going to do it.
So, Adrian, tell us, you have talked about AI, you have talked about uplifted spiders, you've talked about post-humanism. So, do you think that these themes are more of like, social allegories to the problems or the issues the world is facing today?
There's usually something, whether it's a large or a small part of the book, there's usually some part of sort of current affairs that is feeding into it. If nothing else, because it's one of the ways I deal with these things myself. Is, I'm lucky enough I've got that outlet. If something is bothering me, I can put it in a book and at least feel that I've got it off my chest in that way, because otherwise it would come down to screaming out of the window sometimes. Quite often I'm talking about non-human things because I'm writing about empathy for things that are different to us. I mean, it's a major problem in the world. It's certainly one that seems to be on the rise, of the idea of nationalism and xenophobia and any group of people who basically decides, well, if it's not like us, then we don't want it. And I'm doing my small best by writing the books I do to kind of make the alternative case that actually a diversity of viewpoint, a diversity of characteristics is a positive benefit. It's not just the idea that it's a sort of a moral duty, but it's actually, you're going to do better if you've got that sort of variety of solutions to draw on, that variety of viewpoint, that variety of approaches to problems. Even speaking as biologist, genetic diversity is a good thing because it makes you more resistant to disease, for example. And so making the case for that kind of acceptance of the other is a major part of my writing, I suppose.
So being a writer, obviously you would have to do your research, you would have to read other books, you would have to brainstorm, use your imagination. So how do you balance between being creative while preventing burnout?
I'm probably not the person to ask this because I'm writing all the time. I haven't burnt out yet. I don't think I have a magic solution to it, and probably at some point it will happen. Honestly, the best thing I can say is I really enjoy the writing process. I know there is this sort of idea that, writing has got to be hard and you've got to agonize over every word and so forth. But the act of creating through writing is something that I find enormously enjoyable, and that probably helps sort of staving off any kind of burnout.
So have you ever faced writer's block?
I've never had writer's block as it's commonly imagined. I've never just sat there with a blank page and not known what to write. Possibly this is just because I do so much preparation and planning for the books. I have a very solid sense of the world, so I have a sense of where everything is going and what is going to happen next. What I do get frequently is I'll have a scene which I'm writing that isn't working, and it's because I've made some sort of stylistic choice. Probably I need to be seeing it from a different character's point of view, or I need to be telling it in retrospect, or doing something else with those events. But you'll get to a point and you realize, well, I've got to go back. How far do I need to go back to where everything was working properly? But that's really the nearest I've got so far.
So in 2019, you published a novel, Children of Ruin, in which humanity spreads across the universe and they like terraform other planets. So for those aspiring writers who don't know what terraformation is, can you please explain the process?
Well, I mean, in real world terms, it's so terraforming is making something like Earth. And I know people talk a lot about terraforming Mars and things like that. It in real world terms, it would be a fantastically complex and extremely lengthy process. You would need to start sort of chemical changes in the makeup of the world. You'd want to generate atmosphere that people could breathe. You'd want to turn taking Mars as an example. So Mars has a reducing environment. You need to, which means that any oxygen you put in there will just go almost immediately. It'll be sort of sucked into the rocks effectively. You would need to change that. You would need to start with very, very simple life that would create or possibly engineered life that would generate chemicals you wanted and would sequester chemicals you didn't want. There's a lot of technical thinking that has gone into this. I suspect it's not something we will ever do with Mars, because even if you can deal with the chemical balances and get yourself an atmosphere, it doesn't have the electromagnetic radiation shielding that Earth has got. It has a much lower gravity. It has all of these reasons where it's not really ever going to be a particularly useful place to live. You could potentially try and do more with Venus, because Venus is at least the right kind of size, but Venus has an enormous raft of kind of pressure and acidity and heat related problems that you would have to deal with in your terraforming process. From a narrative point of view, it's a very good way of giving you an Earth-like planet that people can live on elsewhere in the universe if you're writing science fiction. So it's much, much easier to do in a book. But yes, I know it's a topic that a lot of people are looking at in a real world sense, but I also think it's one of those areas that potentially, for reasons of getting investment funding in, is enormously the possibilities of it are enormously exaggerated by people who say they can do it. Essentially, sorry, that was a rather clumsy way of saying that, but I think you know what I mean.
So do you think humans can ever live on Mars and terraform Mars?
I do not. I mean, theoretically, you could probably get a research station on Mars. Bear in mind, it's difficult. You know, we have a permanent research station in the Antarctic, and that's difficult enough.
Yes.
Mars is so much more difficult than that, because you don't have a breathable atmosphere. You have problems with highly dangerous radiation. You have appalling dust issues, because very fine dust and low gravity don't go together terribly well for keeping any kind of machinery working. It takes 3 years to get there, and if something goes wrong, it would take 3 years for help to arrive. It's not, it's a long way from ideal. I mean, to my knowledge, we haven't been able to make a hermetically sealed biosphere work on Earth for any length of time to get that balance of elements and living things properly without something sort of running riot and ruining it. And that's what you would need to do on Mars. So I genuinely don't think we are. Unfortunately, I think like I say, the problems get downplayed a lot by people who are very keen on the idea. But it feels a bit like one of those things that people will be saying, oh, within 20 years we'll be on Mars, but they'll still be saying within 20 years in 20 years' time.
So I would like to talk about your 2021 novel, Shards of Earth, in which there are these architects who are like moon-sized beings, and then humans create intermediaries to counter the architects. So what was the story about, and how did you come up with these moon-sized alien beings?
So the idea of like the huge alien thing that turns up and threatens or destroys Earth is a long-standing science fiction trope. I kind of wanted to write a book in that sort of general territory, but rather than the sort of the invading alien that just destroys things, the point of the architects is they turn up and they turn planets into works of art, and nobody knows why. They're completely inscrutable. And I mean, you do find out towards the end of the third book of the series, you find out what is actually going on. But the idea of this thing just turning up and nobody can really stop it. It's enormous. It's powerful. It's got this sort of fine control of gravity so that it can just start pulling things apart, spaceships or indeed planets. And it turns up and it turns Earth into this sort of sculpture, and then it goes away. And then it does it again on another world that humans have colonized. And so it's a war that humans can't fight back in, and that the architects may not even see as a war, because there is until they are first contacted by the intermediaries, they don't seem to realize that people are even there. And it's that idea of humanity as this fugitive species against the enormous and very hostile cosmos. And then you have a lot of other things going on in that series. So there are these sort of elite genetically engineered super soldiers, and there are various alien races, including some very, very weird ones, and a lot of sort of space politics, because it's a space opera, so it's more actiony and less hard science than a lot of my other work. And so there's a lot of fun stuff going on, but really that core idea was just the thing coming out of nowhere that we couldn't understand or communicate with or fight in any way, and just completely reworking the Earth for purposes of its own, and just that what that would do to people as a culture. So the people who escape and the people who live on other worlds, you get this sort of cultural trauma that you see play out in various ways amongst different groups of humans across the books, because the idea that you can never be safe, really. And what that drives people to do is a major theme of the book.
So whenever you're conceiving a story, so do you create your what you call storyboards, or what is the process of outlining all the characters and the dialogues and the scenes?
So when I do my original plan, so I start off making the world, and what that these days tends to be is an enormously messy world document of me just writing down all the things that I want to be in the world and organizing it into different sort of sections. And then possibly making a sort of a glossary of names and things, just so I've got something to refer to. Usually I will then start working on the actual plot, which will arise out of that. So I'll work out who my characters are, and then I'll do a chapter by chapter plan of what's going to happen at each point in the book, which I will then mostly, but not sort of rigidly follow as I write. In some cases these days, I'm experimenting with just making the world and then sort of letting it run off on its own and seeing what it does, though just following characters around and letting them work through the world's logic for me and tell the story that way. And that's been quite an interesting exercise.
Great. So what will be your advice to aspiring science fiction writers?
I mean, this is a tricky one. I wouldn't have advice to do with the actual writing process, because every writer I know has a different way of going about it. As far as getting into print by the traditional publishing route, I think the only useful advice is just make sure that whatever you're submitting to an agent or a publisher is as good as you can make it. If you're in a position where you can get good, unbiased feedback on your writing before you send it in, that's always a good idea. And I've got to say, I was terrible at taking criticism back in the day. But if that is something you can do, that's definitely worth it. But other than that, it's I mean, it took me 15 years to get of writing to get into print. It can be a long haul. You need to be lucky at the end of the day, and that you can't control. What you can control is that when you get that moment where your manuscript is in front of an editor who is looking for that kind of book, and they are in exactly the right place to appreciate what you've written, you want that to be as polished and as good as you can. And that is the thing you can control. And that, I think that's the only useful advice I've got.
Great. So Adrian, what was that feeling when you were told that you have won the Arthur C. Clarke Award and then
Well, I should say I didn't accept the Hugo Award because there were some weird irregularities as to in a very tedious sort of inside science fiction way. That year's Hugo Awards were rather dodgy, and so I don't count myself as having won the Hugo. The Clarke, which I did, was amazing, and it was completely transformative. And I think it turned me from a mostly unknown fantasy writer into a very successful science fiction writer. And honestly, that's my entire career is still very much based on that one moment of winning that award and the extra audience that got me, really. And I still am not entirely sure how a weird book about giant spiders from outer space was able to win the award or became so popular afterwards, but it was definitely all from that moment.
So you have shared your advice to aspiring science fiction writers. What will be your general advice for aspiring writers who would like to write in any genre? Any writing tip that you would like to share?
I mean, honestly, I think read a lot, because whatever genre you're writing in, you want to know what it currently looks like. You do sometimes see someone who has written a lot in one genre, they move to another genre because it looks very easy to them, and then they will produce something which there's not a single idea there that hasn't been thrashed out 100 times before by other writers. So definitely read in the genre that you want to write in, but also really write what you love. I think that there's a lot of feeling that people feel they have to chase whatever is currently popular in the genre, whether or not it's what they would normally write. I feel that you're always going to do your best writing when you're writing about the things that specifically interest you, and that will come out to people who are reading it.
Great. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you, Adrian. Thank you once again for taking out time from your busy schedule, and we hope all the best for your future, that you keep writing about strange worlds, that you lead readers to uncharted territories and make them believe the strange worlds that you create. And it was a pleasure talking to you, Adrian. And any last words, any last thoughts you would like to share?
Oh, just thank you very much for having me on the show.
It was an absolute pleasure. And ladies and gentlemen, this was a very special episode of Between the Lines with Mr. Adrian Tchaikovsky. He is a British fantasy and science fiction author. And if you are a published author, writer, columnist, blogger, poet, or you have an association with the publishing industry within Pakistan or abroad, and you would like to share your story with us, do reach out to us, and we would love to have you on our show. This was today's edition of Between the Lines. I am your host, Muhammad Omar Iftikhar, along with our special first ever international guest, Mr. Adrian, signing off. Goodbye.